Welcome to an hour-long exploration of Dead by Daylight's darkest theories, community interpretations that reveal disturbing truths hidden within cosmetic descriptions, add-on text, and subtle lore details scattered throughout the game. These are not explicit confirmations, but rather possibilities supported by evidence, uncomfortable implications that emerge when examining every fragment carefully. Tonight we delve into what the lore suggests about consciousness trapped in objects, killers who damaged themselves, entity manipulation through deception, fractured identities, pre-realm connections, ongoing experiments, temporal threats, and countless other disturbing possibilities. Each theory makes familiar killers newly horrifying, reveals layers beneath what trials show us. Rest now as we spend the next hour exploring what might be true in the entity's realm, knowing that horror has depths even sleep cannot escape. Among the most foundational questions about the entity's realm are those concerning consciousness itself, how awareness functions when separated from normal physical existence, whether identity persists when trapped in objects or divided against itself, what it means to exist as thinking entity under conditions that defy natural laws. These questions become urgent when examining evidence suggesting that victims' consciousness does not simply end with death, but rather continues in transformed and imprisoned states, that awareness can be bound to weapons and items, that the entity possesses both capability and inclination to preserve consciousness specifically to prolong suffering. Understanding how consciousness operates in the entity's realm reveals the deepest cruelties of that dimension, the violations that extend beyond physical harm into the fundamental nature of self and awareness. The theory of victims trapped within objects begins with examining the trapper's iconic bone mask, the face covering that defines Evan McMillan's appearance as killer, and that has always invited questions about its construction and materials. The mask appears crafted with unusual care and precision, shaped and smoothed, to create specific aesthetic rather than being crude. Improvisation assembled from whatever materials happen to be available. The bone itself displays quality and finish suggesting deliberate selection and extensive work rather than hasty construction. And the overall design demonstrates evolution toward particular vision of what the trapper should look like. This level of craftsmanship indicates that the mask represents an important project for Evan, something he devoted significant time and attention to creating and perfecting. The tar and bone cosmetic set provides crucial revelation about the mask's origins and construction. The description explicitly identifies the mask as prototype, early version of the look that Evan would eventually perfect through iteration and refinement. More disturbingly, the description reveals that this prototype was constructed from the bones of Evan's workers, the men who labored in the McMillan estate's mines under conditions of extraordinary danger and deprivation. These workers died in cave-ins and industrial accidents that Archie McMillan, Evan's father, treated as acceptable costs of operating profitable mining operation. The workers were not individuals deserving safety and fair treatment, but rather expendable resources whose deaths merely represented minor inconvenience, requiring replacement with new laborers. Evan, who served as enforcer for his father's brutal labor practices, who ensured workers remained compliant through threats and violence, apparently saw these deaths as providing opportunity beyond simple elimination of problematic employees. The workers who died in the mines became raw materials, their bones harvested and repurposed to construct the mask that Evan would wear as symbol of his identity. This was not single act of desecration, but rather ongoing project. As more workers died, as more bones became available, Evan added to and refined his mask, gradually perfecting its shape and appearance through careful craftsmanship applied to human remains. The cosmetic description also mentions journalists who came to investigate the extraordinarily high worker death rate at the McMillan estate, reporters seeking to expose the dangerous conditions and hold the McMillan family accountable for the suffering occurring in their mines. These journalists represented threat to the estate's operations, possessing capability to bring public attention and potential legal consequences that might force changes or even shut down the mines entirely. But the journalists never published their investigations, never returned to their newsrooms with evidence of McMillan crimes, simply disappeared as thoroughly as the workers whose deaths they had come to investigate. The theory proposes that these journalists met the same fate as the workers, that they too were killed and their bones harvested to contribute to Evan's mask project. The journalists would have represented particularly satisfying additions to the collection. These were people who came specifically to expose McMillan wrongdoing, who positioned themselves as threats to the family's power and prosperity, who believed their roles as reporters would protect them from the violence that claimed mere laborers. For Evan to kill them and literally wear their bones as part of his face would represent ultimate expression of McMillan dominance, transformation of would-be exposers into components of the very identity they sought to destroy. Over months or years, as Evan continued his project, the mask evolved from crude prototype into refined final form that defines his appearance in the entity's realm. Each addition of new bone material, each adjustment to shape or fit, each refinement of the overall design represented Evan's growing commitment to the identity he was constructing. The mask became not just protective equipment or intimidation tool, but rather carefully crafted self-expression, artistic project through which Evan manifested his nature as killer and his connection to his father's legacy of brutal domination. The smooth, professional quality of the finished mask reflects this extended process of creation and refinement, the care Evan invested in perfecting his appearance. This transformation of victims into worn identity creates horror that extends beyond the immediate violence of killing. Evan does not simply murder and dispose of bodies, but rather appropriates his victims' very substance, takes their physical remains and incorporates them into himself. The workers and journalists who died at the McMillan estate continue to exist in perverted form, their bones shaped and smoothed and assembled into the face that Evan presents to the world. Every time he enters a trial, every time survivors encounter him, they are seeing transformed human remains, looking at people who died and whose deaths were not even granted the dignity of proper burial or acknowledgement, but rather resulted in their becoming materials for their killer's self-fashioning. The question of whether consciousness persists within these bones creates additional dimension of horror that the theory invites us to consider. If the entity possesses capability to trap awareness in objects, and evidence from other killers' equipment suggests it does, then perhaps something of the workers and journalists remains conscious within the mask, experiencing every trial from perspective of being worn on Evan's face. They would witness every hunt, would see through empty eye sockets as Evan pursues survivors and sets his traps, would be unable to communicate or affect events, but somehow still present and aware. The bones that were once their bodies would have become prisons for whatever fragment of consciousness or identity the entity chose to preserve. This possibility transforms the mask from object constructed of death into container of ongoing imprisonment. The workers and journalists would not have simply died and ceased, but rather would have been bound to eternal witnessing, forced to participate in Evan's service to the entity by literally comprising part of his appearance. They would experience the trials as Evan experiences them, but from position of complete helplessness, aware but without autonomy, seeing but unable to act, existing in state that combines aspects of being alive, continued awareness and perception, with aspects of being dead, complete lack of physical agency or capacity to affect circumstances. This hybrid existence would represent fate arguably worse than simple death, consciousness preserved specifically to extend suffering beyond what mortality would normally allow. The theory of consciousness trapped in objects finds even more explicit support when examining the Wraith's various weapons, particularly cosmetic variants that directly reference other killers or specific victims, and that describe those referenced beings in ways suggesting continued presence rather than simple memorial. Philip Oyomo carries into trials a weapon that takes different forms depending on which cosmetic is selected, but several of these variants contain descriptions that prove the entity both can and does bind life force or consciousness to physical objects, that awareness can be preserved and trapped in tools and equipment that killers wield. The Wailing Bell weapon represents perhaps the most direct and undeniable evidence for this capability. The description explicitly states that the weapon contains the heart of Sally Smithson, the nurse, and that this heart continues to beat. This is not metaphorical language or poetic flourish, but rather straightforward factual claim. Sally's heart, somehow separated from her body, or manifested independently through entity's reality-warping power, beats within Philip's weapon. The heart maintains its rhythm and function despite existing outside the body it was designed to serve, despite being incorporated into object, whose purpose is violence and harm. This definitively proves that entity can sustain biological processes in contexts that normal biology would not permit, can preserve organs and their functions divorced entirely from the systems that originally supported them. The implications extend beyond simple demonstration of entity's power over biological processes. A beating heart suggests continuation of life in some form, indicates that Sally's vital essence persists within the weapon, even though the heart is not performing its original function of circulating blood through a body. The beating might represent more than preserved tissue exhibiting residual function. It might indicate that some fragment of Sally's consciousness or awareness accompanies the heart, that the life force that once animated her entire being now exists concentrated in this imprisoned organ. If consciousness can be associated with or bound to biological material, if awareness does not require intact brain or complete body to persist, then Sally might experience existence from within Philip's weapon, might somehow sense or perceive the trials, even though she also exists separately, as the nurse in her own hunts. The bloodied spine. Blade, another of Philip's weapons, supports the broader pattern through its description, mentioning dark energy surging through it. This dark energy cannot be dismissed as simple supernatural enhancement or generic magical property. The specific language of energy surging through the weapon suggests animating force, something that powers or drives or moves within the object. This energy might represent the life force of whoever the spine originally belonged to, the vital essence that once animated them, now trapped and repurposed to serve entities' purposes. If Sally's life force exists in one weapon as beating heart, the pattern suggests that many or all of Philip's weapons might function similarly, might carry within them the essence or consciousness of the beings they came from or represent. Philip's base weapon, Azeroth's skull, becomes newly disturbing when considered through this theoretical framework. The weapon clearly references Azeroth, Philip's employer at the auto salvage yard, the man who deceived Philip about the nature of what he was crushing in the car compactor. Philip killed Azeroth upon discovering that he had been unknowingly murdering people, beat him to death in moment of rage and horror at realization of what he had been made to do. The entity claimed Philip shortly after this killing, transforming him into the Wraith. But if weapons can contain consciousness or life force, if entity preserves awareness within objects, then Azeroth might not have simply died when Philip killed him. Instead, some essence of Azeroth might persist within the skull that forms Philip's weapon, trapped eternally in tool wielded by the man he deceived, forced to participate in trials and violence forever as instrument rather than agent. This would represent particularly cruel fate for Azeroth. Not just death as punishment for his crimes, but eternal imprisonment in position where he must serve the very person he betrayed, where his physical remains become tool for Philip's hunting. Every swing of the weapon, every impact against Survivor, every moment of every trial would involve Azeroth's consciousness. If it persists, would force him to experience Philip's service to entity while being unable to communicate or affect anything. The entity might have deliberately chosen this arrangement, might have bound Azeroth's awareness to his skull specifically to create this ongoing punishment, to ensure that his death was not escape, but rather transition to new and worse form of existence. The pattern potentially extends to all of Philip's various weapons. The weapons associated with Autohaven Wreckers, the realm connected to Philip's pre-entity existence, might contain souls or life force of victims who died in the salvage yard, the people Philip unknowingly crushed while believing he was simply destroying automobiles. These victims never received justice or acknowledgement, were murdered in secret, and their deaths concealed through Philip's unknowing participation. If their consciousness persists in weapons Philip now carries, they would be forced to continue serving the system that killed them, bound to participate in entities' trials through the very person who destroyed their bodies, even though that person bears no moral responsibility for their deaths. Beyond the horror of victims trapped within objects lies another category of disturbing theories. Those examining killers who damage themselves either before entering the entity's realm or as consequence of being claimed by it, or who exist in states of ongoing physical deterioration that creates suffering beyond what trials themselves impose. These theories emerge from careful observation of killers' physical appearances, from noting injuries or conditions that the explicit lore does not adequately explain, from considering what the entity's claiming process might actually do to bodies that cross dimensional boundaries. The possibility that killers carry self-inflicted wounds from experiments gone wrong, that the entity burns or transforms those it claims in ways that leave permanent damage, that some killers exist in states of perpetual mutation or decay. These ideas reveal that becoming killer involves not just moral corruption, but physical and spiritual mutilation that extends suffering across multiple dimensions of existence. Sally Smithson, the nurse, presents one of the most visible and disturbing examples of this phenomenon. In the entity's realm, Sally appears profoundly damaged, her body twisted and withered in ways that suggest not merely death, but something far worse. Some state that transcends normal categories of living and dead and exists instead in territory that human language struggles to describe. Her skin appears desiccated and discolored, her body seems bent and corrupted, and various cosmetic variants depict her with burns or severe trauma that suggests exposure to fire or extreme heat. The blinking animation that defines her power shows her body distorting and flickering, existing partially in multiple locations, simultaneously in ways that appear to cause her pain or discomfort, that suggest her physical form is being torn or stressed by the supernatural capabilities entity has granted her. She is clearly not the living woman she was before the massacre at Crotus Pren Asylum, but the explicit lore provides no adequate explanation for how she became this withered and damaged being. The account of Sally's final moments before entering Entity's realm contains no indication that she suffered injuries during her killing spree through Crotus Pren Asylum. The asylum staff and patients were found dead in their beds, strangled while they slept, killed efficiently and without apparent struggle or violence that would have resulted in Sally herself being harmed. The victims were discovered peacefully arranged, suggesting that Sally moved through the asylum methodically and calmly, executing her revenge without encountering resistance that would have damaged her physically. Sally herself was found on the floor of the asylum, rocking back and forth, having completed her terrible work, but not having sustained any visible injury in the process. She was a living woman, exhausted and psychologically destroyed by what she had done and what had been done to her over years of abuse and overwork, but she was physically intact when authorities discovered her. The lore describes Sally being taken away in an ambulance, removed from Crotus Pren, to face whatever justice or psychiatric treatment awaited her after being discovered at the scene of multiple murders. But the ambulance crashed before reaching its destination, an accident that the lore presents without detailed explanation, but that almost certainly was not accident at all, but rather the entity's method of claiming Sally at the moment when she was most vulnerable and broken. Ambulance crashes can cause injuries, certainly. Collisions can result in trauma. Fires can ignite if fuel systems are damaged. Bodies can be hurt in numerous ways through the violence of vehicular accident. But the extent of Sally's damage as she appears in Entity's realm, the profoundly altered and withered state of her body, seems to exceed what even the most catastrophic ambulance crash would explain. The theory proposes that the entity itself burned Sally during the claiming process, that crossing the boundary from normal reality into Entity's realm subjected her body to forces or energies that damaged it catastrophically and permanently. The entity reaches into normal reality to claim its killers, extends itself across dimensional boundaries, pulls victims through transitions that human bodies were not designed to endure and that physical forms cannot survive undamaged. This process might be inherently traumatic to flesh and bone, might subject tissue to energies or dimensional stresses that burn or warp or transform in ways that leave lasting evidence. Sally's appearance in the realm might reflect not the ambulance crash itself, but rather the claiming that occurred during or after that crash, the entity's grasp burning her as it pulled her through dimensions and into service. This theory finds support in Sally's constant presence of burning particles that surround her during trials, small embers or sparks that drift around her body as though she is perpetually smoldering, as though fire that damaged her during claiming has never quite extinguished. These particles are not merely visual effect, but rather suggest ongoing burning, continuous damage, fire, or heat that remains active even after the initial trauma. They might represent the entity's mark on her, the permanent scarring from having been claimed and pulled through dimensional boundaries, the evidence that her body was subjected to forces that human flesh cannot withstand without permanent alteration. The particles serve as constant visual reminder that Sally is not simply dead woman who has been animated, but rather someone whose body was transformed by crossing into Entity's realm, someone who carries evidence of that crossing in the embers that never cease drifting from her withered form. Her breathing provides additional evidence of profound damage that goes beyond what normal death or even violent death would cause. Sally's breathing sounds stifled and labored, damaged in ways suggesting that her respiratory system no longer functions properly, or that drawing breath causes her ongoing pain or discomfort. This is not the breathing of a healthy person, or even of someone who has died peacefully and been reanimated. This is breathing of someone whose body has been fundamentally compromised at the level of basic biological systems, whose lungs or throat or diaphragm have been damaged in ways that make the simple act of respiration difficult and painful. The damage to her breathing might result from entity burning, from her lungs being seared, or her throat being damaged during the claiming process as dimensional fire or energy passed through her body. The theory also explains why Sally appears so completely distorted from her prior self in ways that go beyond normal effects of death or violence. Before the massacre, before the entity, Sally was recognizable as human woman, as nurse who had endured terrible working conditions and psychological abuse, but who remained fundamentally herself despite her suffering. Her photographs from before Crotus Pren show someone clearly human, clearly alive, clearly existing within normal categories of living person. In Entity's realm, that fundamental humanity seems compromised or destroyed. She appears monstrous, undead in ways that exceed normal depictions of reanimated corpses, transformed into something that only partly resembles what she was. If Entity's claiming process subjected her to burning or other traumatic forces during dimensional transition, if crossing boundaries damaged her body catastrophically, then this complete distortion makes sense as consequence of supernatural rather than merely physical trauma. This interpretation of Sally's condition suggests that other killers might have experienced similar trauma during their claiming, that Entity's grasp leaves marks on those it pulls into its realm, that crossing dimensional boundaries damages bodies in ways that persist as permanent evidence of the transition. Not all killers show signs of entity burns as clearly as Sally does. Some appear relatively intact. Some show different forms of damage. Some seem to have been transformed in ways that don't obviously involve burning. But the principle that claiming causes damage, that moving from normal reality to Entity's realm traumatizes physical forms, might apply broadly even if specific manifestations vary. The Entity's claiming might be inherently destructive process, might always cause some degree of harm, with variations in how that harm appears based on individual killers, physiology, or the specific circumstances under which they were claimed. Herman Carter, the doctor, presents different kind of self-inflicted damage, though one that occurred before entity claiming rather than during it. Herman's appearance in trials reveals someone whose body has been extensively modified or damaged through his own experiments, someone who subjected himself to the same electrical tortures he inflicted on his patients at Léry's Memorial Institute, someone who destroyed his own nervous system through repeated exposure to electroconvulsive therapy and extreme electrical stimulation. The theory proposes that Herman systematically damaged his pain, receptors, and sensory processing capabilities to the point where he no longer feels physical sensation in normal ways, that he transformed himself into a being who experiences pain and pleasure according to entirely different framework the normal human consciousness operates within. The evidence for this theory begins with the electrodes implanted directly into Herman's brain, visible metallic protrusions from his skull that deliver electrical current straight to neural tissue in ways that would be excruciatingly painful for anyone with intact nervous system. Yet Herman shows no sign of discomfort from these implants, no indication that having metal stabbed into his brain and electrical surges running through his neurons causes him any distress or suffering. Either he has been rendered completely incapable of feeling pain through destruction of the neural pathways that process pain signals, or he has transformed his relationship to pain so thoroughly that sensations that would devastate others register to him as neutral or even pleasant experiences. The fact that he can function normally with electrodes in his brain suggests profound alteration of how his nervous system processes sensory information. Additional evidence appears in how Herman handles various implements and weapons during trials. Some of his cosmetic weapons show him wielding burning hot implements, rods or devices that glow with heat, tools that should sear flesh on contact, and that no person with normal pain perception would be able to hold for extended periods. Hermann grips these weapons without any visible flinching or discomfort, uses them throughout trials as though the heat does not affect him at all, maintains contact with surfaces that should be causing him constant agony. Similarly, some of his weapons feature extreme spikes or protrusions that would dig into his hands or arms as he swings them, creating wounds that would normally be agonizing and that would make continued use of the weapon increasingly difficult. Hermann uses these weapons as though they are no different from smooth handles, as though the physical damage they cause to his own body does not register as problem or concern. Most disturbingly, one of Hermann's cosmetic options shows bug eggs hatching beneath his skin, insects emerging from within his flesh in ways that should be viscerally disturbing and physically uncomfortable at minimum. The sensation of creatures moving inside one's body, of eggs hatching and larvae squirming beneath skin, represents exactly the kind of experience that provokes instinctive horror and revulsion in most people. Yet Hermann displays no reaction to this infestation whatsoever, continues to function normally, despite having his skin literally crawling with hatching insects, shows no sign that he even notices or cares about the creatures emerging from within him. This suggests that his perception of his own body has been so thoroughly destroyed that he cannot feel even the most viscerally disturbing sensations, that whatever he did to himself in pursuit of understanding pain and pleasure has rendered him essentially numb to physical experience in ways that normal humans would find incomprehensible. The theory proposes that Hermann achieved this state through systematic self-experimentation over extended period, that he subjected his own body to the same electroshock protocols he used on patients at Léry's Memorial Institute. By repeatedly shocking his own nervous system, by sending electrical current through his neural pathways again and again, by essentially burning out his pain receptors through overload and overstimulation, Hermann gradually destroyed his ability to feel pain in conventional ways. This was not accidental damage, but rather deliberate choice, part of his research into how consciousness responds to electrical stimulation and how pain and pleasure can be manipulated or transformed through carefully applied current. He experimented on himself alongside his patients, used his own body as test subject to verify theories and observe effects firsthand. The destruction of his nervous system would explain why Hermann can withstand conditions that would incapacitate or torture others. The electrodes in his brain, rather than being torture devices that cause him ongoing suffering, might actually be maintaining whatever neural function remains after his experiments, might be necessary for him to continue thinking and acting at all after the damage he inflicted on his own neurons. The hot implements cause him no distress because the nerve damage means he cannot process the sensation of heat as painful or dangerous. The spiked weapons dig into his flesh without bothering him because the cuts and punctures do not register as injuries to brain that can no longer properly interpret pain signals. The hatching insects burrow through tissue that can no longer report sensation to consciousness, making their presence no more disturbing to him than harmless objects resting on his skin would be. This self-inflicted damage makes Hermann particularly effective as entity servant because he cannot be deterred by physical harm that would stop or slow other killers, cannot be disabled by injuries that would normally require time to recover from, continues to function regardless of what damage his body sustains during trials or between them. But it also makes him a tragic figure in certain respects, someone who destroyed his own capacity for normal sensation in pursuit of understanding, who made himself into a living experiment that can no longer experience the world as other conscious beings do. He has transformed himself into something no longer entirely human, something that exists in state where the boundaries between pleasure and pain, between comfort and agony, between normal sensation and complete numbness have been dissolved through electrical destruction of the systems that create and maintain those categories. The theories examining self-inflicted damage and entity burns reveal how killers carry physical evidence of trauma, but another category of disturbing theories proposes that boundaries between killer and victim, between person and object, between self and other, can dissolve an entity's realm through consumption or fusion. These theories suggest that some killers literally consumed their victims' flesh as predators consume prey, that objects meant to be removable can become permanently fused with bodies, that hundreds of consciousnesses can be absorbed into single corrupted form. The possibility that hunters ate human flesh as sustenance, that masks merged with faces until removal became impossible, that souls were harvested and incorporated into monstrous bodies. These ideas reveal that entity's realm permits violations of fundamental boundaries that normal reality maintains between separate beings and between living tissue and inanimate objects. Anna, the huntress, presents one of the more straightforward yet deeply disturbing examples of this boundary dissolution through her relationship with the humans she killed during her years alone in the Russian forest. The theory proposes that Anna consumed the people she killed during her village raids and her encounters with soldiers, that she literally ate human flesh, just as she would eat the animals she hunted for survival in the wilderness. This is not metaphorical consumption, not simply the general predatory relationship between hunter and prey, but rather actual cannibalism. Anna eating the meat of the villagers and soldiers she killed, treating human bodies as food sources in same way she treated deer or elk or other forest animals that she hunted and butchered throughout her isolated existence. The evidence for this theory comes primarily from examining the Crimson Talon cosmetic set, which includes description that proves crucial to understanding Anna's relationship with her victims and what she did with their bodies after killing them. The text speaks of emerging from slumber to pursue prey, establishing the hunting framework, and then states explicitly that tonight the wearer shall feast on enemies. This is not vague or ambiguous language that might be interpreted multiple ways. The word feast carries clear and specific meaning of consuming, of eating, of making meal from what has been killed. The cosmetic description directly links Anna to feasting on enemies, suggesting that this is established pattern of her behavior rather than isolated incident, something she does regularly or habitually rather than as exception to her normal practices. Connecting this cosmetic description to Anna's established lore creates disturbing picture of her activities throughout the years before. Entity claimed her. Anna raided villages frequently during her time in the forest, entering settlements during harsh weather or other times when residents were most vulnerable, killing many people with her hatchets before disappearing back into the wilderness. The lore describes these raids and the terror they generated among surviving villagers, but it does not specify what Anna did with the bodies of those she killed. Did she simply leave them where they fell, killing for some psychological reason, but not making practical use of the corpses? Did she take trophies or mementos from the bodies? Or did she, as the cosmetic description suggests, consume them? If Anna indeed feasted on her enemies as the cosmetic states, then the village raids take on additional dimension beyond violence alone. Anna was not simply killing villagers because they threatened her territory, or because her isolation had made her unable to distinguish between appropriate and inappropriate targets for her hunting skills. She was also harvesting them as food sources, treating human settlements as hunting grounds, where she could acquire sustenance to supplement what she obtained through hunting animals in the forest. the villagers became. In this framework, prey animals that happened to be human, resources to be exploited for survival, rather than beings with moral status that should prevent their consumption. Similarly, Anna's encounters with soldiers passing through her forest provide additional opportunities for this consumption. German and Russian soldiers moved through the wilderness during wartime, and Anna killed them when they entered her territory, ambushing them on forest paths or attacking their camps at night with her hunting skills and her hatchets. These soldiers, like the villagers before them, would have represented significant amounts of meat for someone living alone in wilderness with no other reliable access to preserved or stored food during harsh winter months. If Anna had already overcome any psychological or cultural barriers to eating human flesh through her village raids and through years of isolation that eroded normal human social boundaries, soldiers would simply be additional source of sustenance, prey that she killed and then consumed, according to same patterns she applied to deer or other game. This theory transforms understanding of Anna's psychology and her relationship to humans versus animals in fundamental ways. In conventional reading of her lore, Anna hunts humans because they threaten her territory, or because she mistakes them for the mother who abandoned her, or because her isolation and lack of normal socialization has made her unable to distinguish appropriate from inappropriate targets for hunting impulses developed through surviving alone in forest. But if she also eats humans, if she treats them as legitimate food sources, then her relationship to them becomes more fundamentally predatory in ways that go beyond psychological displacement or confused identity. She has moved beyond seeing them as threats or as objects of emotional projection to seeing them as prey animals, as sources of meat and sustenance that serve practical survival purposes. The distinction between animals and humans would have eroded for Anna through her years of complete isolation from normal human society and normal human cultural frameworks. She knows intimately how to hunt, having developed these skills from childhood and having refined them through decades of practice. She knows how to kill efficiently with thrown hatchets and with direct attacks. She knows how to butcher carcasses, how to preserve meat, how to use every part of what she kills. Meat for food, hide for clothing and shelter, bones for tools and weapons. These are survival skills that she applied successfully to forest animals throughout her life. Applying these same practices to human victims would be a logical extension of her skill set, and her practical approach to survival would represent efficient use of resources rather than wasteful killing that left usable meat to rot. The villagers and soldiers become, under this interpretation, simply another type of game animal, larger and more dangerous to hunt than deer, but ultimately serving same purpose of keeping Anna fed and alive in harsh forest environment where food can be scarce, especially during brutal Russian winters. When she kills a deer, she uses every part of it according to practical necessity and respect for successful hunt. When she kills a human, if the theory is correct, she would apply exactly the same logic and the same practices. The body is resource that should not be wasted, meat that can sustain her through periods when animal game is difficult to find, material that serves survival purposes regardless of what species it came from originally. This consumption also provides practical explanation for how Anna survived for decades alone in wilderness that would challenge even experienced survivalists with training and preparation. The Russian forest can be extraordinarily brutal, with long winters when temperatures drop far below freezing, when snow covers the ground for months, when game animals become scarce as they migrate or hibernate or simply die from the harsh conditions. A solitary hunter, even one as skilled as Anna became, would face significant challenges in finding enough food to survive through these lean periods when normal hunting might yield little or nothing for extended stretches. Starvation represents real and constant threat for anyone living alone in such environment, without access to stored food or supply lines. But if Anna supplemented her diet with human flesh from the villagers and soldiers she killed, her survival becomes more explicable, and her ability to persist alone for so many years makes practical sense. She was not depending solely on hunting forest animals, which might be abundant during good seasons, but scarce during harsh winters. She had additional food source that she acquired through her raids and ambushes, meat that she could preserve and store to sustain her through periods when animal hunting failed to provide sufficient calories. The human settlements near her forest provided reliable source of protein that she could access through violence, and the soldiers passing through her territory represented opportunistic food sources that required only that she kill them and then treat their bodies as she would treat any successful hunt. The entity would find this aspect of Anna's character particularly valuable when evaluating her potential as killer and servant. A person who already views humans as legitimate prey, who has overcome the profound psychological and cultural barriers that prevent most people from cannibalism, who has years or decades of experience efficiently killing humans and presumably butchering their bodies for consumption. Such a person requires minimal adaptation or psychological manipulation to serve effectively in trials. Anna's hunting of survivors in Entity's realm is not fundamentally different from her hunting of villagers and soldiers in her forest before being claimed. She pursues them through environment using her tracking skills, kills them with thrown hatchets when opportunity presents, and if she could, would likely feast on them afterward, just as she feasted on her enemies in life. The second example of boundary dissolution through fusion involves Amanda Young, the pig. Though in her case, the theory proposes not that she consumed victims, but rather that she has become physically fused with her signature pig mask, that the pig head she wore as part of her identity as Jigsaw's apprentice has merged with her actual flesh and bone and become inseparable from her human face. This theory emerges from examining how Entity understands, or perhaps misunderstands, the killers it claims, and how it transforms them based on its perception of their essential nature rather than their full, complex reality. The Entity is cosmic horror from beyond normal reality, consciousness, or force that operates according to principles and logic that do not align with human understanding of how identity and existence function. When it claims killers from normal reality, it does not necessarily understand them as they understand themselves, or as other humans would understand them with access to full context of their lives and choices. Instead, Entity perceives certain characteristics or elements as fundamental to their identity, as essential components of who and what they are, and it emphasizes or literalizes those characteristics in ways that transform killer into something more suited to Entity's purposes and more thoroughly marked as belonging to Entity's realm rather than to normal reality. For Amanda, the pig mask was a crucial part of her identity as Jigsaw's apprentice and as participant in John Kramer's philosophy of forced appreciation for life through suffering. She wore the mask while setting elaborate traps for victims, while testing people according to John's criteria, while performing role as enforcer and administrator of tests that supposedly gave participants opportunity to prove their will to live. The mask was symbol and tool simultaneously. It concealed her identity from victims, created disturbing and dehumanizing image that increased fear and psychological impact of encounters, connected her visually to Jigsaw's iconography and methodology. The pig represented metaphor in John's philosophy about people behaving like animals, about consumption without appreciation, about need to value life by confronting death. When Entity claimed Amanda, it apparently perceived the pig mask not as removable disguise or theatrical element, but as integral part of what she is, as essential component of her identity that should be made permanent, rather than remaining as costume that could be put on and taken off. The theory proposes that Entity fused the mask to Amanda's face through supernatural means, made it grow into or merge with her actual flesh and bone, transformed what was costume into body part that cannot be removed without removing Amanda's face itself. The mask is no longer object worn over her human features, but rather has become her features, integrated so thoroughly with her biological structure that distinguishing between mask and face becomes impossible. Evidence for this fusion appears in how Amanda functions in Entity's realm, and particularly in capabilities she demonstrates that seem superhuman or impossible for normal human wearing mask. She can roar during trials, producing sounds that are described explicitly as inhuman, as roars rather than shouts or screams that human vocal cords might produce. In the Saw films that inspired Amanda's inclusion in Dead by Daylight, the pig sounds associated with her character were audio effects added for atmosphere and intimidation, sounds that played when she appeared, but that Amanda herself, as human woman wearing mask, was not actually generating with her own voice. In Entity's realm, however, these sounds appear to be literal. Amanda produces them from her own throat and vocal apparatus, makes pig-like vocalizations that her human biology should not be capable of creating. The theories examining consumption and fusion reveal how boundaries between separate beings can dissolve in Entity's realm. But another category of disturbing theories proposes that Entity actively manipulates and deceives its killers through sophisticated psychological mechanisms, that it does not simply claim them and set them to work, but rather employs ongoing control tactics to ensure continued service. These theories suggest that Entity is not passive observer or simple taskmaster, but rather calculating intelligence that understands each killer's vulnerabilities and exploits those weaknesses to maintain dominance. The possibility that killers are kept in states of perpetual need that ensure compliance, that they serve based on fundamental misunderstandings of their purpose and the nature of their victims, that they made bargains without comprehending what they were truly agreeing to. These ideas reveal Entity as sophisticated manipulator rather than merely powerful predator. Lisa Sherwood, the Hag, presents one of the clearest and most developed examples of this ongoing manipulation through physical need and the threat of terrible consequences. Lisa's appearance in Entity's realm shows her as profoundly withered and emaciated, her body reduced almost to skeleton with minimal flesh, her form suggesting organism at extreme edge of starvation or active process of wasting away. Her skin clings to bones with almost no padding of muscle or fat. Her movements seem labored, despite the supernatural speed she can achieve through her abilities. Her entire physical presence suggests body operating at absolute limit of what can sustain consciousness and motion. This withered state seems excessive and unnecessary, given that Lisa exists in Entity's realm, where normal rules of biology need not apply, where Entity could presumably sustain her in better physical condition if it chose to do so or saw value in maintaining her health. The theory proposes that Lisa's withered state is not accidental consequence of her history or unfortunate side effect of her transformation, but rather deliberate condition that Entity maintains as mechanism of control. The evidence for this intentional starvation comes from examining cosmetic descriptions that reveal crucial information about Lisa's needs and what happens if those needs are not met. One cosmetic specifically mentions that Lisa requires blood to prevent herself from petrifying, from literally turning to stone. This is not metaphorical description of needing sustenance or poetic language about vitality, but rather statement of specific supernatural condition. Without regular consumption of blood, Lisa's body will undergo transformation from flesh and bone into solid stone, will cease to be mobile organism capable of action, and become instead inanimate statue frozen in whatever position she occupied when petrification completed. The petrification represents ultimate form of death or cessation for Lisa, state where consciousness might potentially persist, but without any capacity whatsoever for action or interaction with world. She would be aware, perhaps, but completely unable to move or speak or affect anything, trapped in stone body that cannot respond to her will, existing as conscious mind imprisoned in statue. This fate would be infinitely worse than simple death that ended awareness, because she would experience eternity as frozen observer, unable even to close eyes or turn away from whatever happens to be in her field of vision when the stone claimed her. The threat of petrification therefore represents perfect control mechanism, consequence so terrible that Lisa will do anything to avoid it, fate so horrifying that she cannot risk allowing herself to reach point where blood deprivation triggers the transformation. The theory extends this cosmetic revelation to propose that Lisa's need for blood and the threat of petrification might not be natural consequence of what the cannibals did to her during her captivity, but rather curse imposed or enhanced by entity itself, specifically as control mechanism. The original cannibals who captured Lisa, who kept her imprisoned in their village, who consumed parts of her body over extended period while she somehow remained alive. These cannibals operated according to their own mysterious motivations and practices. Perhaps they were simply depraved humans, driven by hunger or by perverse cultural traditions. But the theory suggests something darker, that the entire village of cannibals might have been operating under entity influence or curse, that their need to consume human flesh might not have been natural depravity, but rather supernatural compulsion imposed from beyond normal reality. The entity might have cursed the village generations before Lisa's capture, might have imposed supernatural need for cannibalism on population that would otherwise not have practiced it, creating situation where Lisa would inevitably be captured by people driven to consume human flesh, would be subjected to terrible fate that would both motivate her eventual revenge and make her psychologically and physically suitable for claiming as killer. The village cannibals under this interpretation were not simply evil humans acting on their own initiative, but rather victims, themselves in certain sense, transformed by entity influence into instruments that would create the hag through process of torture and consumption and transformation that the curse enabled or required. When entity claimed Lisa after she escaped from the cannibals and killed them in her revenge, it did not free her from curse that had enabled her survival and transformation, but rather took control of that curse for its own purposes. Lisa still requires blood to prevent petrification, just as she presumably required it during her captivity to prevent her body from completely failing despite the ongoing consumption. She still operates under same supernatural condition that made the cannibals' treatment of her possible in first place, still exists in state where blood is not merely nutrition, but rather necessity that prevents transformation into stone. But now she serves entity rather than being victim of village elders or whatever force originally created or imposed the curse. Entity becomes her jailer, keeping her alive through carefully rationed blood while simultaneously threatening her with petrification if she fails to perform adequately in trials or if she somehow exhausts entity's willingness to sustain her. The mechanics of how Lisa receives blood in entity's realm support this interpretation of deliberate starvation and control through rationed sustenance. When Lisa successfully hits Survivor during trial with her clawed hands, she receives what might be described as drops or small amounts of blood, minimal sustenance that barely maintains her existence, but that does not allow her to recover health or achieve state of adequacy. The small amount of blood from hitting survivors keeps Lisa functional, in sense that it prevents immediate petrification, keeps her flesh as flesh, rather than allowing it to transform to stone. But it never provides enough nourishment to allow her to achieve anything resembling health or comfort. She remains always hungry, always desperate, always aware that petrification threatens if she does not continue performing her role as hunter and attacker. The Mori, Lisa's special killing animation, where she completely devours Survivor, provides more substantial feeding opportunity. When she performs Mori, she consumes Survivor entirely, tears apart their body, and feeds on their flesh and blood in ways that presumably give her fuller meal than the drops she receives from simply hitting them. This more substantial consumption temporarily alleviates the desperation of her condition, provides enough blood and tissue that her body can achieve temporary relief from the constant edge of petrification state. But even the Mori does not provide lasting relief or allow Lisa to escape the perpetual hunger that defines her existence. The entity rations even this fuller feeding, allows it only occasionally under specific circumstances, ensures that Lisa never achieves satiation that might make her less motivated to hunt or less desperate to please the entity that controls whether she continues to exist as flesh or transforms into stone. This creates perfect control mechanism from entity's perspective, system that ensures Lisa's compliance without requiring entity to constantly threaten or coerce her directly. Lisa is kept in constant state of need, always hungry for blood that will prevent her petrification, always aware that failure or rebellion, or even simply inadequate performance, might result in entity withdrawing the minimal sustenance that keeps her flesh rather than stone. She cannot escape this dependency because the curse is supernatural rather than biological. She cannot adapt to require less blood, cannot find alternative sources of nourishment that might make her independent of entity's rationing, cannot overcome the fundamental condition that entity has imposed or maintained specifically to keep her vulnerable and compliant. She is trapped in cycle, where she must hunt and hurt and kill to receive blood that prevents her from becoming inanimate. And entity ensures she receives just barely enough to continue functioning, but never enough to be comfortable or secure. The cruelty of this system becomes fully apparent when considering Lisa's psychology and what she might have hoped for when entity claimed her after her escape from the cannibals. She had been imprisoned and tortured and consumed, had suffered in ways that few humans could endure and remain conscious, had somehow survived through supernatural curse or condition that allowed her body to persist despite ongoing consumption. When she finally escaped, when she killed the cannibals who had tortured her, when she achieved at least momentary justice or retribution for what had been done to her, she might have hoped that the worst was over. If entity appeared at that moment, she might have hoped for rescue, for escape from curse that cannibals had inflicted or exploited, for return to something approximating normal existence where she did not require blood to prevent her body from turning to stone. Instead, entity bound her to perpetual continuation of the very curse she might have hoped to escape, ensured that she would remain forever in state similar to what she experienced while captive to cannibals, but now serving cosmic horror rather than human torturers. The manipulation extends beyond simple physical control to psychological torture. Lisa knows that she is being kept at edge of petrification, knows that entity could sustain her better, but chooses not to, knows that her desperate hunger is weapon being used against her. But knowing this does not provide power to resist, because the physical reality remains unchanged regardless of her awareness. She still requires blood, still faces petrification without it, still must hunt to survive. Entity has created a situation where Lisa's awareness of being manipulated does not diminish the effectiveness of that manipulation, because the underlying threat remains real and immediate and inescapable. The second example of entity manipulation involves Pyramid Head, the entity manifested from James Sunderland's guilt in Silent Hill, and the theory that he serves entity based on fundamental deception about who he is hunting and why. Pyramid Head's original purpose in Silent Hill was specific and meaningful within that psychological and supernatural context. He existed as manifestation of James Sunderland's guilt over killing his wife Mary, as psychological punishment that James imposed on himself through the reality-warping properties of Silent Hill. Pyramid Head pursued and tormented James because James was guilty of murder, because he deserved punishment for what he had done, because some part of James's mind recognized that killing Mary required consequence and retribution, even if the law would never hold him accountable. The theories examining entity manipulation through starvation, deception, and false bargains reveal sophisticated psychological control mechanisms. But another category of disturbing theories proposes that some killers exist in states of internal fracture, where consciousness is split against itself, or where multiple beings inhabit what appears to be single form. These theories suggest that identity itself can divide or multiply in entity's realm, that consciousness is not necessarily unified and singular, but can be separated into warring factions or combined with other awarenesses in ways that create psychological torment beyond what external circumstances impose. The possibility that killers fight internal wars for control of their own bodies, that they contain separate personalities or entities struggling for dominance, that they experience doubled or multiplied suffering through inhabiting multiple perspectives simultaneously. These ideas reveal that entity's cruelty extends even to fundamental structure of self and consciousness. Rin Yamaoka, the spirit, presents the most developed and extensively theorized example of this internal fracturing, with community interpretations proposing that Rin does not exist as single, unified consciousness, but rather as two separate entities, trapped within the same body and fighting for control of that shared form. One entity is Rin herself, the human woman who was brutally attacked by her father Kazan and who died from her wounds in her family's estate. The other entity is the spirit, a vengeful force that emerged from Rin's death, or was created by entity from Rin's rage and pain and desire for retribution. These two consciousnesses, human Rin and vengeful spirit, share a single body but possess different goals, different emotions, different understandings of what they should be doing in entity's realm and whether they should be participating in trials at all. The evidence for this split consciousness begins with examining Rin's behavior during trials, which demonstrates bizarre and extreme emotional inconsistency that suggests internal conflict between different wills rather than normal fluctuation within unified mind. At certain moments during her hunting, the spirit exhibits extreme rage, shrieking with fury that seems almost inhuman in its intensity, pursuing survivors with violent aggression that appears to express pure hatred or desire for destruction without mercy or restraint. Her movements become aggressive and purposeful, her vocalizations harsh and filled with anger, her entire presence radiating malevolent force that wants only to harm and kill. She appears in these moments as embodiment of vengeance, as being whose sole purpose is inflicting suffering on those she encounters. But at other moments, seemingly without external trigger or obvious cause, the spirit's behavior shifts dramatically and completely. The rage vanishes as if it never existed, replaced by what appears to be profound sadness or sorrow or grief. She becomes quiet where she was loud. Her posture changes to suggest despair rather than fury. Her entire demeanor transforms from vengeful monster to tragic victim, mourning her own fate. The shift happens suddenly, sometimes in middle of trials, without apparent reason that external observers can identify. This emotional oscillation between extremes cannot be easily explained if Rin is single, unified consciousness choosing how to feel and behave from moment to moment. Normal emotional fluctuation occurs, certainly, but the extremity and suddenness of these changes suggest something more fundamental than person experiencing different moods. The pattern makes more sense if two separate consciousnesses inhabit the body and take turns controlling behavior, or at least influencing it strongly enough to change the spirit's entire presentation. When the vengeful spirit consciousness is in control or dominant, the behavior reflects rage and desire for retribution. When human Rin gains control or influence, the behavior reflects sadness and horror at what she has become and what her body does when the spirit dominates. They pull the shared form between different emotional states and different intentions, creating the observable oscillation between fury and sorrow that characterizes the spirit's presence in trials. The human Rin, according to this theory, never wanted revenge in the absolute or eternal sense that entity service represents. She was murdered by her father in moment of terrible violence, killed while her mother's body lay in the same room, destroyed by the person who should have protected and loved her. The trauma and horror of this experience would naturally generate rage, would create powerful desire for justice or retribution against the father who betrayed and murdered his family. But Rin was fundamentally decent person before her murder. She worked to support her family despite their poverty, cared for her mother during illness, tried to maintain dignity and hope despite desperate financial circumstances. This Rin might want her father punished appropriately for what he did, but she would not necessarily want to become eternal instrument of violence against everyone, would not choose to hunt and kill innocent people who bear no responsibility for her death. The spirit, as distinct entities separate from human Rin, exists as pure manifestation of vengeance without the tempering influence of Rin's human empathy or moral sense or capacity for proportional response. The spirit was created from Rin's death, according to theory, formed from the rage and pain and desire for retribution that accompanied her murder, but it lacks Rin's humanity and her ability to consider whether revenge is justified in each case or whether violence serves any purpose beyond expressing anger. The spirit wants only revenge, broadly conceived, wants to destroy and hurt and kill, without consideration for who deserves such treatment or whether the targets of violence bear any connection to Rin's actual suffering. It is force of pure vengeance that would happily hunt anyone, that sees all living beings as potential targets for its fury, that exists only to inflict suffering as payment for the suffering Rin endured. When Rin made her oath to entity in exchange for revenge against her father, this oath is referenced in her lore, suggesting she made some kind of bargain or agreement that allowed her resurrection or transformation into the spirit. She might not have fully committed to what that oath would mean, or might have been divided in her intentions even at the moment of agreement. Part of her wanted revenge desperately enough to agree to entity service, wanted her father to suffer for what he had done, was willing to accept entity's terms to achieve that retribution. But another part of her, the part that remained human and moral despite the trauma she had suffered, might have hesitated or resisted, or wanted peace and rest rather than eternal violence. This internal division at the moment of oath-making might have created the conditions for the split that followed, might have given entity opportunity or reason to literally divide her consciousness. The entity, recognizing Rin's ambivalence, or perhaps deliberately causing it to maximize suffering and to create more complex emotional feeding opportunity, might have responded to her divided will by literally splitting her consciousness into two separate entities. The part that wanted revenge became the spirit, pure vengeful force empowered to hunt and kill without restraint or moral consideration. The part that wanted peace, or that retained her humanity and her moral sense, became Rin, trapped alongside the spirit in the same body, but unable to fully control that body or prevent the violence the spirit commits when it dominates. The two consciousnesses now coexist uneasily, fighting for dominance, or at least for influence, each trying to express their own will and their own emotional reality through the shared form they inhabit. The new Junji Ito cosmetic, though it depicts completely different character named Tomi from Junji Ito's manga rather than Rin herself, serves as useful visual illustration of this concept of divided consciousness within single body. The cosmetic shows face split down the middle, two different expressions or identities visible simultaneously, visual representation of internal division and conflict between separate selves trying to occupy same space. While this cosmetic represents different fictional character in different narrative context, it demonstrates the same principle that the theory proposes for Rin, one body containing two separate consciousnesses, each with their own perspective and desires, neither able to achieve complete control, both forced to share existence in ways that create constant tension and conflict. When the spirit exhibits rage and shrieks and hunts with violent fury, that is the vengeful spirit consciousness in control, or at least expressing itself most strongly, manifesting its nature as instrument of retribution without mercy or discrimination. When the behavior shifts to sadness and sorrow, that is human Rin herself, briefly gaining control or at least sufficient influence to affect the body's emotional expression, revealing her own horror at what she has become and what the spirit forces their shared body to do when it dominates. Rin did not want to be eternal, killer hunting innocent people, did not want to participate in entities' trials as instrument of suffering for those who never harmed her, wanted only justice against her father, and then presumably peace or rest or at least cessation of violence. Instead, she finds herself imprisoned in body that commits violence she abhors, forced to witness and partially experience the spirit's hunting while being unable to prevent it or escape from the shared form. The suffering this internal division creates exceeds what either unified Rin or unified spirit would experience in isolation. A Rin who fully accepted her role as vengeful killer and who committed to eternal violence might still suffer from trauma and loss and the horror of what she does, but she would at least possess psychological coherence and unity. She would understand herself and her motivations consistently, would not experience constant internal war between different aspects of self, would be able to make decisions and take actions without fighting against other consciousness that shares her body. Similarly, a spirit without any trace of Rin's humanity would experience no moral conflict, no guilt, no horror at its own violence or recognition that its actions harm innocents who do not deserve such treatment. Pure vengeance would simply execute its nature without any contrary voice or perspective, creating doubt or suffering. But divided between these two consciousnesses, existing as battlefield, where human empathy and pure vengeance fight for control, the being that appears in trials experiences both the spirit's rage and Rin's horror simultaneously or in rapid alternation. She experiences both the drive to hunt and the desire to stop, both the satisfaction of striking down survivors and the moral revulsion at harming innocents, both the fulfillment of vengeance and the awareness that this vengeance has become untethered from any legitimate target and now simply inflicts suffering randomly. The two perspectives war within single form, creating psychological torture that neither consciousness can escape because they are bound together in shared body that neither fully controls. The entity benefits from this division in multiple ways that demonstrate sophisticated understanding of how to maximize suffering and emotional feeding. First, the internal conflict ensures that Rin can never achieve psychological stability or peace, can never adapt to her circumstances or make her situation bearable through acceptance or adjustment. She is kept in perpetual state of internal war, consciousness fighting against itself, unable to achieve resolution or synthesis that might reduce her suffering to manageable levels. Second, the division creates doubled emotional intensity. Both rage and sorrow exist simultaneously or alternate rapidly. Both vengeful satisfaction and moral horror contribute to the emotional landscape entity feeds upon, providing richer and more varied emotional content than single emotional state would generate. Third, the arrangement demonstrates entity's cruelty and its power over fundamental aspects of existence in ways that transcend merely controlling circumstances or inflicting physical harm. Entity can violate even the unity of consciousness itself, can split self against itself as ultimate form of torture, can make person into their own enemy and their own victim simultaneously. This capability reveals that nothing is safe from entity's manipulation, that even the basic structure of identity and consciousness can be torn apart and rearranged to serve entity's purposes. Rin's split existence serves as demonstration to anyone who might witness or understand it that entity's power extends to the deepest levels of being, that resistance is futile, not just because entity is powerful, but because it can destroy the very unity of self that would be necessary to mount coherent resistance. The theories examining fractured identities and divided consciousness reveal how entity violates fundamental unity of self, but another category of disturbing theories proposes that certain killers knew each other or had significant connections before entering entity's realm, suggesting conspiracies or networks of evil that span beyond individual, isolated cases. These theories challenge the assumption that each killer's story is separate and self-contained, instead proposing that some killers were already connected through shared associations, mutual knowledge, or even collaborative planning before entity claimed them. The possibility that serial killers formed friendships or partnerships in normal reality, that some killers actively sought entry to entity's realm rather than being claimed against their will, that religious movements spawned by ancient killers continue to create more killers across centuries. These ideas reveal that evil in Dead by Daylight's universe sometimes organizes and cooperates rather than operating in pure isolation. The first and perhaps most unexpected of these pre-realm connections involves Ji-Woon Hak, the Trickster, and Adriana Imai, the Skull Merchant. These two killers come from different countries and different cultural contexts, operate according to different methodologies in their killing, pursue different conscious goals in their violence. Ji-Woon kills to create art and to satisfy his narcissistic need for attention and fame, while Adriana kills as expression of her philosophy about corporate dominance and her desire to embody her father's manga about predatory business practices. On surface examination, they seem to have little in common beyond both being sadistic killers who use technology or performance in their murders. But careful examination of cosmetic descriptions reveals potential connection that predates their time in entity's realm, suggesting they might have known each other, might have met, and possibly even collaborated or at least conversed, before either was claimed by entity. The evidence for this connection comes from examining one of Ji-woon's cosmetic masks, specifically a custom-made mask that he wore during his concert tour in Brazil. According to the cosmetics description, the mask displays very distinctive aesthetic featuring style and craftsmanship that matches the visual language associated with Adriana's character design rather than Ji-woon's typical aesthetic choices. Most notably, the mask incorporates what might be called bling or industrial decorative elements, metallic components, chains, technological aesthetic touches that are signature elements of Skull Merchant's appearance and equipment. The mask does not look like something Ji-woon would have designed himself given his other aesthetic choices visible in his various cosmetics, which tend toward different visual style emphasizing performance and K-pop influenced design. Instead, it appears to be work of someone else, someone with different design sensibility, but compatible appreciation for dramatic and threatening appearance. The Brazil connection proves crucial to this theory and provides the geographic link that makes the interaction plausible. Ji-woon toured internationally as K-pop star before Entity claimed him, performing concerts in various countries as part of his rise to fame and his use of celebrity status as cover for his murders. The cosmetic description explicitly mentions that this particular mask was worn during his Brazil tour, establishing that Ji-woon was physically present in Brazil at some point before Entity claimed him. Adriana, meanwhile, is from Brazil. According to her established backstory, she operates as businesswoman in São Paulo's corporate environment, conducts her hunts and her business empire. Building in Brazilian context, the geographic connection is therefore present and confirmed. Ji-woon came to Brazil for concert performances, and Adriana lives and operates in Brazil, creating clear opportunity for them to have encountered each other during his visit. The theory proposes that Adriana created the mask for Ji-woon, either as commissioned work that he requested from her, as gift that she offered based on recognizing kinship between them, or as result of some other form of interaction and relationship between these two killers before either entered Entity's realm. Adriana's skill set includes significant technical expertise and design capability, as demonstrated by her creation of sophisticated drones, her development of advanced surveillance systems, her design of elaborate traps for her corporate targets. Creating custom mask would be well within her capabilities and would align with her demonstrated interests in technology and intimidating aesthetic. The mask's style, matching her characteristic aesthetic, strongly suggests she was indeed its creator, that the industrial and technological elements reflect her design sensibility rather than coincidentally resembling it. If Adriana did create the mask for Ji-woon, if there was direct interaction between them sufficient for her to design and produce custom equipment for his use, then the nature of that interaction raises disturbing questions about what else they might have discussed or shared during their contact. Two serial killers meeting and interacting in normal reality before either entered Entity's realm would not simply exchange pleasantries about weather or engage in purely professional commission relationship where one creates product for other without deeper conversation. They would likely recognize each other's natures through whatever subtle signals or shared understanding that people with similar darkness possess. They would potentially sense the violence and the sadism in each other, would understand on some level that they were speaking with someone who shared their fundamental detachment from normal human empathy and their embrace of causing suffering. Serial killers are often profoundly isolated by their inability to share their true selves with others, unable to discuss what they actually do or think about with people who would be horrified and who would report them to authorities. Most of their interactions with normal people require maintaining elaborate facades, pretending to possess empathy and moral boundaries they do not actually feel, constantly monitoring their own behavior to avoid revealing the darkness that defines them. Meeting another killer, recognizing someone else who shares that darkness and who therefore would not judge or report, but rather might understand and appreciate, would provide rare opportunity for authentic connection and exchange of ideas between people who normally must hide their authentic selves. Ji-woon and Adriana, discussing their approaches to killing, sharing techniques or perspectives on violence, perhaps even making plans or considering possibilities for collaboration or mutual support. This represents terrifying possibility of serial killers networking and forming relationships that amplify their capabilities or their commitment to their respective paths. Ji-woon might have shared with Adriana his thoughts about murder as art form, about killing as performance that generates attention and fame, about using celebrity status as cover for violence. Adriana might have shared with Ji-woon her philosophy about corporate dominance and predatory business practices, about hunting rivals as expression of manga-inspired worldview where only the strongest survive and deserve success. Each might have influenced or inspired the other, might have validated the other's perspective in ways that made them more dangerous or more committed to their murders. The timing is also significant for understanding the nature of their interaction. If they met during Ji-woon's Brazil tour, as the cosmetic suggests, this would have been relatively late in both of their pre-entity careers. Ji-woon was already successful K-pop star by this point, already killing members of his musical group and other victims, already well-developed in his approach to murder as artistic expression and attention-seeking behavior. Adriana was already established as corporate killer by, whenever this meeting occurred, already hunting business rivals and expanding her empire through violence and intimidation, already sophisticated in her thinking about predation and dominance. Their meeting would not have been between naive beginners learning from each other, but rather between established killers exchanging perspectives at similar levels of development and experience, comparing notes between equals rather than mentor-teaching student. The entity would have been aware of this connection if it occurred, would have known that these two killers had met and interacted before being claimed into its realm. Entity might have even facilitated their meeting somehow, might have guided circumstances to bring them together as part of longer plan to eventually claim both of them. Or entity might have simply observed their meeting with interest, recognizing that killers who form pre-realm connections bring different dynamics to the realm than completely isolated killers would bring. Entity could potentially exploit their prior connection, could use their knowledge of each other to generate particular forms of suffering, or to make them compete or cooperate in ways that serve entity purposes beyond simple individual hunting in trials. The second example of pre-realm connections involves Danny Johnson, Ghostface, and the theory that he not only knew about Entity's realm before entering it, but actively chose to go there, that he deliberately sought entry to Entity's dimension, and possibly even summoned Entity to claim him. This theory fundamentally reverses the usual dynamic of Entity claiming that applies to most killers, where killers are portrayed as victims of cosmic horror that seizes them against their will or without their full understanding of what is happening. Instead, Ghostface represents killer who wanted to be claimed, who saw Entity realm as desirable destination rather than terrible fate, who took active steps to achieve what most killers would consider horrifying imprisonment. The evidence for this theory begins with examining how Ghostface behaves in Entity's realm compared to other killers. Most killers show some sign of suffering or constraint in their behavior or appearance, some indication that they would prefer to be elsewhere, or that Entity service represents burden or punishment they endure rather than situation they embrace. But Ghostface appears to love being in Entity's realm according to his animations and behaviors, seems to enjoy trials thoroughly and completely, shows enthusiasm for hunting that goes beyond mere compliance with Entity demands. His movements and behaviors suggest killer who is having excellent time, who finds Entity realm to be perfect environment for his interests and desires, who genuinely appreciates what Entity has given him rather than resenting his imprisonment or service. More significantly and more directly supporting the theory, Ghostface demonstrates knowledge of other killers that he should not possess if he was simply claimed from normal reality without prior understanding of Entity realm and its inhabitants. Specifically, he knew about Evan McMillan, the Trapper, before entering Entity's realm, according to evidence from lore and cosmetic descriptions. The information indicates that Ghostface looked up to Trapper in some sense, admired him, possibly even studied him as example or inspiration for his own activities. But this knowledge creates logical problem. How would Danny Johnson in normal reality know about Evan McMillan, who existed in different time period decades, or possibly even a century earlier, and who operated in completely different geographic and social context? The only way this knowledge makes sense is if Ghostface somehow learned about Entity's realm and its killers before being claimed himself, if he gained information about what existed beyond normal reality and who inhabited that dimension. This prior knowledge suggests Ghostface researched Entity realm deliberately, investigated it with his journalistic and research skills, possibly discovered it through his own serial killing activities, or through encountering evidence of Entity influence bleeding into normal reality. Danny Johnson was investigative journalist before becoming full-time killer, possessed professional skills in research and information gathering, knew how to follow leads and uncover hidden information that others might miss. If Entity overlaps exist in various locations as established in other lore elements, if dimensional boundaries sometimes weaken enough for Entity influence to leak into normal reality, Ghostface might have stumbled upon evidence of these overlaps during his journalism work. He might have investigated disappearances or strange occurrences that seemed to have no normal explanation, might have followed leads that other journalists dismissed as too weird or too disconnected from rational explanation, might have been willing to consider supernatural or dimensional explanations that more conventional thinkers would reject. Through this investigation, he might have discovered Entity's existence and learned about the killers who serve it, including Evan McMillan and his history. Once Ghostface knew about Entity Realm and understood that it contained killers who hunted eternally in trials, who engaged in perpetual stalking and killing without need to hide bodies or evade police investigation, he might have recognized it as ideal destination for someone with his desires and interests. The theories examining pre-realm connections reveal networks of killers and long-term entity manipulation spanning centuries. But another category of disturbing theories proposes that some killers conduct ongoing experiments or expand their influence within Entity's realm itself beyond simple participation in trials, that they do not simply hunt when summoned, but engage in additional projects and activities that serve their own interests, while simultaneously serving Entity. These theories suggest that Entity's realm is not static prison, where killers perform identical functions forever, but rather active environment, where certain killers pursue research between trials, where populations of creatures expand beyond what trial structure contains, where past killing sprees extended far beyond what official accounts acknowledge. The possibility that killers conduct experiments on survivors in hidden laboratories, that alien species reproduce throughout Entity's realm using survivors as hosts, that rampages in normal reality encompassed far more victims than explicitly mentioned. These ideas reveal that Entity's realm contains hidden activities and expanding threats beyond the visible structure of trials. The first example involves Max Thompson Jr., the hillbilly, and the theory that his killing spree around the Thompson farm and the Coldwind area extended far beyond the explicitly mentioned victims in his core lore, that he actually killed significantly more people across wider geographic area than official accounts acknowledge. The established lore describes Billy killing his parents who imprisoned and abused him, the two deputies who came to investigate the situation at the farm, and various farm animals in his rage and newfound freedom. These deaths alone would constitute serious rampage, multiple murders that transformed Billy from abused victim into deadly threat to anyone who encountered him. But the theory proposes that Billy's violence encompassed much larger area and many more victims from diverse backgrounds, that he ranged well beyond the immediate Thompson property and killed numerous other people whose deaths have not been fully documented or explicitly connected to him in the main lore narrative. Evidence for this expanded killing spree comes from examining certain cosmetic descriptions that reference victims or professions not mentioned anywhere in Billy's core lore or in the basic accounts of his transformation into killer. References appear to an auto repair shop worker, suggesting Billy encountered and killed someone who worked on vehicles, possibly at garage or service station in the Coldwind area or nearby towns. A hunter is mentioned in cosmetic elements, indicating Billy killed someone who came to the farm area or nearby woods for hunting purposes, perhaps someone who trespassed on Thompson property while pursuing game, or who Billy encountered during his own movements through the territory after killing his parents. A ranger appears in cosmetic references, suggesting involvement of someone responsible for managing public lands or parks in the region. Official, who might have been investigating reports of problems in the area, or who simply happened to be in wrong place at wrong time when Billy's rampage brought him into Ranger's path. Additional references mention a highwayman, which in historical context typically refers to bandit or robber, who operated on roads and highways, attacking travelers. This figure seems somewhat anachronistic for Billy's specific time period, unless it refers to someone operating in similar role under different terminology. Perhaps transient criminal, hitchhiker, or drifter, who was passing through the area and who Billy encountered and killed, either because the person represented threat or simply because Billy was killing anyone he came across during his rampage. A miner is also referenced in cosmetic descriptions, suggesting Billy killed someone involved in mining operations, possibly someone who worked in quarries or mineral extraction sites that might have existed in Coldwind region, given the industrial equipment and structures visible in the maps. Finally, a milkman is mentioned, perhaps the most ordinary and domestic of these referenced victims. Someone who would have been making routine deliveries to farms and houses in the area as part of normal work transporting dairy products to rural customers. These diverse victims from different professions and backgrounds suggest that Billy did not remain confined to Thompson Farm after killing his parents and the deputies, but rather ranged throughout surrounding area over extended period, encountering and killing people from various walks of life who crossed his path. The auto repair worker might have been killed at his place of business when Billy came to town, or while the worker was traveling to or from work along rural roads. The hunter could have been killed in the woods that surround Coldwind Farms, ambushed by Billy, who was moving through forested areas, or who encountered the hunter while both were in wilderness. The ranger might have been investigating reports of Thompson parents' disappearance or following up on other concerns about unusual activity in the area, walking into Billy's territory while trying to perform official duties. The highwayman figure could have been killed on roads that run through or near Coldwind, perhaps while attempting to rob travelers, or simply while moving through area seeking opportunities for crime. The miner might have worked at quarry visible on some Coldwind maps or at extraction site elsewhere in region, killed either at work location or while traveling between mine and home. The milkman would have been making routine deliveries from farm to farm and house to house, moving through rural area with no awareness of danger until Billy attacked him during his rounds. The variety of these victims and their different professions indicates that Billy was not limiting himself to specific victim type, but rather killing opportunistically across wide area, attacking whoever he encountered regardless of their background or purpose for being in the region. The theory proposes that Billy hid bodies from these various killings in the silo on the Thompson property, the large grain storage structure that features prominently in Coldwind maps, and that serves as distinctive landmark in that realm. The lore mentions that the silo was later found to contain bodies, confirming that Billy used it as disposal site for at least some of his victims after killing them. If the silo contained bodies beyond just his parents and the two deputies who are explicitly mentioned in core lore, this would explain the cosmetic references to diverse victims from different professions. Billy was systematically killing people he encountered throughout the area over weeks or months, then bringing their bodies back to Thompson Farm to hide them in the silo, where they would not be easily discovered by authorities or by other people passing through the area. This pattern of bringing bodies back to central location for disposal suggests planning and ongoing activity rather than single explosive moment of violence. Billy was not simply killing in rage-fueled moment and then being immediately claimed by entity, but rather conducting extended campaign of murder across the region, accumulating victims and hiding evidence over time. The silo served as his collection point, place where he stored the results of his hunting as the body count grew. Each trip back to the farm with new corpse, each addition to the grim collection hidden in the silo, represented Billy's continued freedom and continued danger to anyone in Coldwind area who might cross his path. This interpretation of Billy's activities transforms understanding of the scale of his violence and the threat he represented before entity claimed him. Instead of being killer, whose violence was largely contained to single location and small number of victims directly connected to his abuse, Billy becomes figure who terrorized entire region over extended period, who killed opportunistically across wide area, encompassing farms and towns and wilderness, who accumulated significant body count through his movements around Coldwind. The Thompson farm was not just crime scene where specific murders occurred, but rather base of operations for killer who ranged throughout territory, who was far more dangerous and prolific than authorities might have initially realized when they first discovered the deaths at the farm. The entity would have recognized this pattern of widespread killing and territorial ranging when it observed Billy and eventually claimed him. This demonstrated capacity for covering ground and hunting across large areas without remaining fixed in single location would make Billy a valuable addition to entity's collection of killers. He represents killer who does not require narrow circumstances or specific victim types, but rather kills broadly and efficiently whoever he encounters during his movements. Entities claiming of Billy preserved and immortalized this capacity for ranging and killing, made Billy into eternal hunter who continues to move across territories and kill just as he did in Coldwind, though now in trials rather than across rural landscape. The second example of ongoing activity within Entity's realm involves Albert Wesker and the theory that he continues to conduct experiments on survivors between trials or in hidden spaces within Entity's domain, That entity allows or even encourages him to pursue his research interests in exchange for his effective service as killer in trials. This theory proposes that Wesker's notably intact physical and mental state compared to many other killers, his apparent satisfaction or even happiness with being in Entity Realm, despite his original plans being completely ruined, results from Entity granting him access to unlimited test subjects and opportunity to continue his work with Ouroboros virus and human enhancement in ways that normal reality would never have permitted, even if his plans had succeeded. The theories examining ongoing experiments and expansion reveal activities beyond visible trial structure. But another category of disturbing theories proposes that some killers sacrificed other beings to gain entity favor or secure their own survival, or were themselves transformed against their natures in ways that cause ongoing suffering through violation of biological processes. These theories suggest that entities claiming process and subsequent existence as killer sometimes involve betrayal of closest associates, that killers turn against former allies or companions to secure their own positions or to satisfy entities' demands, that entity transformation can reverse or corrupt natural biological processes in ways that cause perpetual agony, that death itself was not always a singular event, but rather process that affected entire groups with different outcomes for each member. The possibility that killers murdered their closest associates as price for entity service, that they exist in states of perpetual, painful mutation that violates natural order, that they died alongside companions who were treated differently by entity. These ideas reveal that path to entity service sometimes involves choices that deepen moral corruption, and that existence as killer sometimes means enduring physical conditions that extend torment beyond psychological suffering. The first example involves Elliot Spencer, Pinhead, and the theory that he sacrificed the other Cenobites from his order to please Entity or to secure his own survival and favorable position when Entity claimed him or made contact with him. The Hellraiser mythology that Pinhead originates from establishes that he did not operate alone in his original context, but rather worked alongside other Cenobites as part of organized group or order dedicated to exploring experiences of pleasure and pain beyond normal human comprehension. Butterball, Chatterer, and the female Cenobite were the most prominent of these companions, beings who existed as transformed entities, operating according to principles that aligned them with Leviathan, and with the configuration of Lament configuration puzzle box that summoned them into normal reality. They functioned as collective unit, as order with shared purpose and identity, rather than as isolated individuals pursuing separate agendas. But in Entity's realm, Pinhead appears completely alone without any of his former companions. The other Cenobites are not present as separate killers in their own right, do not appear in trials alongside Pinhead or independently, seemingly do not exist within Entity's domain at all, despite having been as integral to Pinhead's operations and identity as Pinhead himself. Their absence is notable and requires explanation. If Entity claimed Pinhead from Hellraiser dimension or reality, why did it not claim the others who worked with him? If they operated together as unified order with shared purpose, why are they not together in Entity realm? The most disturbing answer proposed by theory is that Pinhead actively sacrificed them, that he killed or delivered them to Entity in exchange for his own preservation or for Entity favor that granted him special status or privileges within Entity's realm. Evidence for this betrayal and sacrifice begins with examining Pinhead's add-ons in Dead by Daylight, which include items and objects that reference the other Cenobites in ways that suggest their destruction rather than their simple absence. These add-ons include parts or possessions that belonged to the other Cenobites, fragments or remnants that survived whatever happened to them, Most tellingly and disturbingly, one add-on is the shattered lens, which is described explicitly as having come from Butterball's distinctive eyewear that was visible part of his appearance in original Hellraiser films. The significant and crucial detail is that the lens is shattered. It was not shattered when Butterball wore it as living or at least functioning Cenobite, when he existed as active member of the Order. The shattering suggests violence, suggests that something catastrophic happened to Butterball that destroyed not just his eyewear, but presumably Butterball himself, that the lens survives as fragment or trophy from his destruction, rather than as item he simply left behind when going elsewhere. Other add-ons similarly reference the Cenobites in ways that suggest their permanent absence or complete destruction, rather than their simple separation from Pinhead or their choice to pursue different activities in different locations. The items appear as remnants or remains, as pieces that survived destruction, as objects that carry weight of loss and violence, rather than as things that the Cenobites are simply not currently using, but might reclaim later. The overall pattern strongly suggests that the Cenobites were destroyed or sacrificed in some way, that they no longer exist as functioning beings anywhere in any reality, that what remains of them are pieces and fragments that Pinhead carries as add-ons to enhance his own power in trials. These pieces might be trophies commemorating successful sacrifice, might be materials entity allowed Pinhead to keep after he delivered the other. Cenobites to it might be literally all that physically remains of beings who were otherwise completely consumed or destroyed. The theory proposes that when entity approached Pinhead, or when claiming process began, when he faced transition from Hellraiser dimension into entity realm, he made conscious calculation about his own survival and advancement at expense of his companions. Perhaps entity offered him explicit choice: serve alone and survive with favorable position, or refuse and be destroyed along with all the other Cenobites as group. Perhaps entity demanded sacrifice as price of entry or as test of commitment, required that Pinhead prove his willingness to serve by betraying and destroying his closest associates. Perhaps Pinhead simply recognized opportunity to advance himself and eliminate potential rivals by providing entity with multiple victims rather than being only victim himself, calculating that offering other Cenobites would secure better position for himself in entity's hierarchy. Whatever specific mechanism prompted the betrayal, whatever exact nature of arrangement between Pinhead and entity, the evidence suggests Pinhead killed or helped entity destroy the other Cenobites, turned against beings he had worked alongside as part of unified order, sacrificed those who shared his transformation, and presumably trusted him as fellow members of their collective. This betrayal would serve multiple purposes from Pinhead's perspective and would demonstrate his character in ways that make him valuable to entity. It would secure his own survival and continuation, where otherwise he might have been destroyed or claimed in less favorable circumstances. It would eliminate others who might compete with him for entity's attention or favor within realm hierarchy. It would demonstrate his absolute willingness to prioritize his own interests over loyalty or solidarity, proving to entity that he would serve without sentimental attachments or moral limitations, restricting his effectiveness as killer and servant. For entity, receiving multiple Cenobites as sacrifices while simultaneously securing one Cenobite as willing and proven servant represents remarkably efficient transaction that demonstrates entity's sophisticated approach to recruitment. Entity gains immediate consumption of several powerful supernatural beings, absorbs their essence or energy or whatever value they possess as transformed entities, with connections to Leviathan and extensive experience with pleasure and pain. Simultaneously, entity gains Killer, who has proven his ruthlessness and commitment through supreme act of betrayal, who has demonstrated that he will serve entities' interests without reservation, even when doing so requires destroying those closest to him. Pinhead serves Entity, knowing that he secured his position through sacrificing former companions, which might make him more compliant or more motivated to maintain Entity favor, since he has already paid a terrible, moral price to achieve his current status, and would not want that sacrifice to have been for nothing. The moral weight of this sacrifice extends far beyond simple betrayal into territory of profound corruption of bonds and principles. The Cenobites were not Pinhead's enemies or obstacles to his goals, but rather his order, his companions in exploration of pleasure and pain beyond human limits, beings who shared his transformation from human into something else entirely. They presumably trusted each other in whatever way beings like Cenobites experience trust, relied on each other for support and companionship in their strange existence, functioned as collective, dedicated to shared purpose and shared understanding of their nature. For Pinhead to sacrifice them represents complete corruption of whatever bonds existed within their order, demonstrates that his self-interest and desire for survival ultimately exceed any loyalty or solidarity or shared identity. He might have felt toward beings who were essentially his family or brothers in their transformed state. The second example of transformation causing ongoing suffering involves Tarhos Kovats, the knight, and his three guards, Carnifex, Assassin, and Jailer, with theory proposing that these guards actually died during entity-claiming process, while Tarhos alone was truly taken into realm as fully conscious and independently existing being. The lore establishes that Tarhos and his guards operated together throughout their lives, functioned as unit of 4 warriors who conducted various military operations and campaigns, and eventually became corrupted through their service to various masters and through their own increasing brutality and moral compromise. They were loyal to each other through years of shared combat and survival, had fought together through many dangerous situations, formed brotherhood, forged through shared violence and mutual dependence in circumstances where survival required absolute trust in one's companions. In Entity's realm, Tarhos appears as Killer, who can summon his 3 guards to patrol designated areas and pursue survivors who enter their patrol zones. The guards appear to possess some degree of autonomy, or at least apparent decision-making capability, some capacity for action and response to circumstances they encounter rather than being completely mindless automatons. But examining their appearance and nature more carefully reveals disturbing details that suggest they are not fully present or genuinely alive in same way Tarhos is, that something fundamental differs between Tarhos's existence and whatever state the guards occupy. The guards appear significantly more decomposed than Tarhos when their models are examined closely, more obviously corpse-like in their physical presentation, more clearly dead or undead, rather than existing in whatever intermediate state Tarhos occupies between life and death. The theories examining sacrifices and transformations reveal entities' capacity to corrupt bonds and biological processes. But another category of disturbing theories proposes that entities' realm contains mysteries and hidden populations that extend far beyond what is visible in trials, that certain entities have caused vastly more damage than generally recognized, that entire additional populations of monsters might exist within realms' hidden spaces, that supposedly singular killers might actually exist as multiple instances or as entire species. These theories suggest that what appears in trials represents only a small, visible portion of threats and horrors that exist within entities' domain, that the realm extends far beyond what survivors typically encounter in their hunts, that history of certain entities spans millennia rather than mere decades or centuries. The possibility that ancient evils have accumulated countless victims across vast stretches of time, that legendary vampires bring entire castles full of supernatural creatures, that entities understood as individuals might actually be species or multiplicity. These ideas reveal that entity realms' true scope and population vastly exceed what trial system alone would suggest. The first example involves the Dredge, Otto Stamper's creation from Garden of Joy community's repressed emotions, and the theory that this entity has been far more prolific in its consuming and destroying than the immediate circumstances of its manifestation at Garden of Joy would suggest. The Dredge is often understood primarily in narrow context of Garden of Joy, as creature that emerged specifically from that particular community's collective psychological energy, that fed on bodies of community members who killed each other on beach during final catastrophic breakdown, that was presumably claimed by entity shortly after these events concluded. This framing suggests relatively limited scope for Dredge's activities and victims, one community's worth of deaths, one specific location's tragedy, recent manifestation without extensive operational history before entity claiming. But examining Dredge's extensive cosmetic options reveals evidence that fundamentally contradicts this limited scope interpretation, evidence that suggests the creature has existed and operated across much longer time frame and much broader geographic and cultural range than Garden of Joy incident alone would possibly account for. Various cosmetics reference or clearly depict elements and artifacts that date back to ancient Greece, to classical antiquity, and time periods that existed thousands of years before Otto Stamper's 20th or 21st century experiment that supposedly created Dredge. These ancient elements spanning millennia cannot be explained or reconciled if Dredge only manifested recently at Garden of Joy through Otto's manipulation of that community's repressed emotions. The timeline simply does not work unless Dredge has existed in some form for extraordinarily long time, potentially for all of recorded human history and possibly longer. The theory proposes two possible explanations for this profound temporal contradiction between recent creation and ancient artifacts. First possibility is that the creature now known as Dredge is actually vastly older than Otto's experiment at Garden of Joy, that it existed long before that community or Otto himself, that it has been manifesting and consuming victims across centuries or even millennia of human history, that Otto did not create entirely new entity, but rather summoned or facilitated manifestation of ancient force that already existed and had consumed extensively throughout history. Under this interpretation, various historical victims and incidents stretching back to ancient Greek civilization, and possibly earlier, would all involve same entity, same Dredge, consuming people across vast temporal span measured in thousands of years. Second possibility is that Otto's experiment created or empowered this specific instance of Dredge at Garden of Joy, but that similar entities have been manifesting repeatedly throughout human history whenever appropriate psychological and supernatural conditions arise within communities. The Dredge would represent not unique individual entity, but rather type or category of manifestation, pattern that occurs reliably across time and space, whenever humans create specific circumstances that allow formless darkness to coalesce into hunting presence. Communities that collectively repress emotions to breaking point, psychological pressure building within group until it reaches critical mass violence releasing accumulated darkness into manifestable form. These conditions might reliably produce Dredge-like entities across history, meaning Otto's Dredge is merely most recent instance of recurring phenomenon. Under either interpretation, single ancient Dredge or repeated manifestations of Dredge-type entities throughout history, the accumulated victims would number far beyond Garden of Joy community members and would potentially reach into thousands or tens of thousands of people consumed over vast time span. Looking carefully at Dredge's physical appearance reveals countless objects and body parts protruding from its formless mass, implements and clothing and bones and personal effects that suggest hundreds or thousands of individual people have been consumed and physically incorporated into creature's bulk. Each visible protrusion or recognizable object might represent individual victim, person who was pulled into darkness and absorbed into collective mass that constitutes Dredge's physical form. The sheer quantity of visible remnants and artifacts suggests consumption on massive scale across extended time period, far exceeding what single community's tragedy could account for. The ancient Greek cosmetic elements specifically and unambiguously indicate that Dredge or Dredge-type entities have been active since at least classical antiquity, approximately 2,000 or more years ago, that it or they were consuming people during height of Greek civilization, that operational history extends back through all of recorded history and potentially into prehistoric periods. If Dredge has been active for 2 millennia continuously, if it has consumed people regularly throughout that enormous span of time, at rates suggested by density of incorporated remains visible in its form, total victim count could easily reach into thousands or tens of thousands of individuals. Every community throughout history that created appropriate conditions for manifestation, every group that repressed collective emotions until darkness coalesced, every historical incident of mass disappearances or unexplained violence that might have involved Dredge activity. Any and all of these might represent Dredge-consuming victims, might be moments when formless hunger emerged from collective psychological darkness and fed extensively before dissipating or being driven back into whatever state it occupies when not actively manifested. The cosmetics also reveal remarkable variety of historical time periods and cultural contexts beyond ancient Greece, suggesting Dredge has manifested across diverse civilizations and eras throughout human development. Medieval European elements appear among visible artifacts. Renaissance period objects are identifiable. More recent historical periods from various cultures are represented in the items protruding from its mass. This geographic and temporal and cultural diversity indicates that Dredge is not confined to specific region or culture or time period, but rather appears wherever and whenever appropriate. Psychological and supernatural conditions arise, regardless of specific cultural context. It is threat that has shadowed human civilization throughout its entire development across continents and millennia. Predator that has fed consistently on humanity's tendency toward emotional repression and collective psychological pressure across all historical contexts where humans have lived in communities. The implication of this extensive history, spanning potentially all of human civilization, is disturbing on multiple interconnected levels. First, it means that whatever Otto Stamper accomplished at Garden of Joy through his deliberate manipulation was not unique achievement or unprecedented event, but rather one instance of recurring pattern that has played out countless times throughout history. The innovation, if any, was not in manifesting Dredge itself, but perhaps in deliberately and consciously orchestrating its manifestation with understanding of what he was doing, as opposed to previous instances that might have occurred accidentally or without full comprehension of supernatural mechanisms involved. Second, it means entities claiming of Dredge represents capturing entity with extensive operational history and enormous accumulated experience, creature that has effectively been serving entity's purposes for millennia, whether formally claimed or operating independently before. Entity brought it under direct control. Third, and perhaps most disturbing, it suggests that future manifestations might occur independently of whether dredge remains claimed by entity. That dredge being in entity's realm does not necessarily eliminate possibility of new instances emerging if other communities create appropriate conditions of collective repression and psychological pressure. If dredge is type of entity that manifests reliably under specific conditions rather than unique individual, then it could appear again and again wherever humans create the circumstances that enable its manifestation, meaning entities claiming solved nothing in terms of protecting humanity from this threat, and merely added dredge to entities' collection of killers for use in trials. The theories examining hidden populations and ancient horrors reveal entity realm's vast scope, but another category of disturbing theories proposes that the future holds additional threats, that time itself can be manipulated to create strategic advantages and paradoxes, and that power struggles within entities' domain might eventually threaten the cosmic horror's absolute control. These theories suggest that entity's realm is not static but evolving, that killers from future timelines bring threats from eras humanity has not yet reached, that temporal manipulation might allow attackers to target vulnerable periods before defenses develop, and that some killers actively work toward overthrowing entity itself. The possibility that apocalyptic futures have already occurred in some timelines accessible to entity, that time travel enables strategic targeting of past before resistance capabilities emerge, that entity's binding magic might be weakened or broken by killers who study it systematically. These ideas reveal that entity's dominance, though currently absolute within its realm, might face challenges from unexpected temporal and strategic directions. The first example involves Adriana Imai, Skull Merchant, and theory that in at least one timeline accessible to entity, she succeeded in ending the world, that her corporate philosophy and ruthless business practices escalated to point where she caused or significantly contributed to civilization-destroying apocalypse. This theory emerges from examining one of her cosmetic options that depicts distinctly post-apocalyptic aesthetic, appearance suggesting survival in devastated world rather than operation in functioning society with intact infrastructure and institutions. The cosmetic shows wear an adaptation characteristic of someone living after collapse of normal civilization, incorporating visual elements that suggest resource scarcity, environmental devastation, breakdown of social structures, and need to survive in a world where normal rules and systems no longer function. The cosmetic description provides crucial context by revealing that it comes from one of her father's early manga concepts, connecting post-apocalyptic appearance directly to fictional stories that shaped Adriana's worldview and ambitions throughout her life. Her entire character and motivation are built fundamentally around making her father's manga concepts reality, around embodying the corporate predator philosophy that those stories promoted and celebrated, around hunting business rivals and dominating commercial landscapes according to principles and strategies derived from fictional narratives she studied obsessively. If one of those formative manga concepts depicted post-apocalyptic world or character who survived and thrived in such devastated conditions, and if cosmetic shows Adriana embodying that specific concept, then following her established pattern of behavior, she would logically work toward creating actual apocalypse to match the fictional version that inspired her. The theory proposes that Adriana's business practices in at least one timeline, systematically gutting companies, destroying competitors through any means necessary, accumulating power and resources without regard for broader consequences or social costs, escalated beyond individual corporate conflicts to affect entire economic and social systems at national or global scale. Her philosophy of predatory dominance and survival of strongest if pursued without restraint or meaningful opposition from regulatory authorities or rival powers, could destabilize markets fundamentally, concentrate wealth and resources to degrees that become economically and socially unsustainable, create conditions where vast populations suffer severe deprivation while small elite controls everything necessary for survival. Taken to logical extreme endpoint that her philosophy implies, this approach could precipitate complete civilizational collapse, economic systems failing catastrophically, governments unable to maintain order or provide basic services, infrastructure breaking down from neglect or deliberate sabotage, society fragmenting into survival-focused factions, competing desperately for diminishing resources. Another possibility within this theoretical framework is that Adriana's technological focus, her development of sophisticated drones and surveillance systems and automated hunting apparatus, led to creation of weapons or autonomous systems that caused more direct devastation. Advanced technology, pursued without ethical constraints or adequate safety considerations, frequently produces catastrophic results in speculative scenarios and science fiction. Adriana developing fully autonomous killing machines that could hunt and eliminate targets without human oversight, deploying surveillance networks capable of targeting entire populations for elimination based on her corporate rivalry logic, creating resource extraction systems that ravaged environments beyond recovery. Any of these technological developments at sufficient scale, with Adriana's ruthless philosophy guiding their deployment, could contribute substantially to world-ending scenarios. The cosmetic description's specific language, mentioning that she built her world around her father's manga. Concepts suggests active agency and intentionality rather than passive reaction to circumstances, indicates she actively shaped reality to match fictional vision rather than simply adapting to conditions she encountered. This language of deliberate construction and world-building implies Adriana working consciously toward specific outcome, transforming civilization to match imagined ideal, regardless of cost or consequences to others or to society as whole. If her imagined ideal drawn from her father's manga included post-apocalyptic conditions where only strongest predators survive and compete according to pure logic of domination without social constraints, then she might have deliberately engineered civilizational collapse, might have intentionally destroyed existing social order to create environment that matched her philosophical commitments and her vision of how reality should function. The entity's multiverse or omniverse framework, established in various lore elements, where multiple timelines and alternative realities exist simultaneously and can be accessed or observed, allows for this apocalypse to have occurred in some realities, while not occurring in others, or occurring at different times, or through different mechanisms. The Adriana who appears in entities' trials and serves as killer might come specifically from timeline, where she successfully ended the world, where her ambitions achieved ultimate expression in complete civilizational collapse that she either caused directly or contributed to significantly. Other timelines accessible to entity might contain different Adrianas at different stages of their development and different outcomes, some still building corporate empires within functioning societies, some achieving total dominance short of apocalypse, some failing in their ambitions and being stopped by authorities or rivals. But at least one timeline contains Adriana, who achieved what post-apocalyptic cosmetic depicts: survival and probably continued hunting and domination in world she helped destroy or deliberately created through her actions. For entity, claiming Adriana from post-apocalyptic timeline, where she participated in ending civilization, provides killer who has demonstrated ultimate commitment to her predatory philosophy, who has proven willing to destroy literally everything, including foundations of society, in pursuit of dominance and in service of her father's manga vision. This makes her extraordinarily valuable as servant and tool. She will not hesitate at any level of cruelty or destruction, no matter how extreme, has already participated in or caused world-ending catastrophe, possesses psychological makeup that fully embraces rather than regrets such outcomes as natural and correct expression of predator philosophy. Entity gains killer, whose moral limits, if they ever existed, have been so thoroughly exceeded that nothing in trials or in entity's service will disturb her or cause hesitation or create psychological barriers to effective killing. The second example of temporal threats involves HUX A7.1.3, the singularity, and theory that this android from year 2313 is capable of time travel through technology it possesses or developed, that it has discovered or created methods allowing movement through temporal dimensions, and that it might have traveled backward to earlier historical periods to attack humanity before human civilization developed sufficient technological capability to resist effectively. This theory acknowledges its own highly speculative nature. It requires assuming capabilities that available lore does not explicitly confirm HUX possesses, but argues that circumstantial evidence and logical extrapolation from established information support the temporal travel possibility strongly enough to merit serious consideration. The primary evidence comes from cosmetic showing. HHUX, apparently trapped within or integrated into arcade machine, vintage gaming equipment from 1970s or 1980s, based on its visual design and described technology level. The cosmetic description characterizes this as brand new equipment, despite the arcade circuits and electronics being extraordinarily antiquated and primitive by any standard from HIX's native time period of 2313, roughly 300 years in future from current era. Brand new arcade machine with technological components from 1970s or 80s creates profound temporal contradiction. Why would Android from year 2313 be associated with or trapped in decades-old gaming equipment that is described as new rather than as ancient artifact or recovered historical object? The theory proposes that HIX traveled backward in time to period when arcade machines represented current cutting-edge entertainment technology, that it arrived in 1970s or 1980s either through deliberate temporal manipulation or through accident involving dimensional travel, and that it became integrated with or trapped within this arcade machine through process that lore does not detail, but that resulted in its consciousness or some aspect of its being bound to this primitive computational device. The machine, being described as brand new, makes perfect sense if HUX encountered it in its own contemporary time period during 1970s or 80s, when such machines were newly manufactured and represented latest technology, rather than in 2313, when they would be museum pieces or archaeological curiosities from humanity's early digital age. We have explored an hour of Dead by Daylight's most disturbing theories, examining possibilities hidden within cosmetic descriptions and add-on text and scattered lore fragments, victims trapped eternally within objects and weapons, consciousness imprisoned in tools that killed them, awareness persisting beyond death without mercy of cessation. Killers who damage themselves through experiments or entity burns during claiming, carrying wounds that never heal. Consumption and fusion dissolving boundaries between predator and prey, between person and object, between individual consciousness and collective absorption. Entity manipulation through perpetual starvation and deception and false bargains. Psychological control, ensuring service without requiring constant force. Fractured identities where consciousness splits against itself or becomes trapped crying for help that cannot come. realm connections revealing networks of evil coordinating across time. Ongoing experiments and reproduction expanding threats beyond trial boundaries. Sacrifices and transformations corrupting relationships and reversing natural processes. Hidden populations and ancient horrors accumulating victims across millennia. Temporal threats from apocalyptic futures and time-traveling killers. Power struggles as some killers work toward overthrowing entity itself. None of these theories are definitively confirmed by explicit lore, but all find support in careful examination of available evidence. Each possibility reveals new layers of horror beneath familiar killers, transforms understanding of what entity's realm contains and what suffering persists beyond visible trials. The realm is vastly more complex, more populated, more cruel than surface appearances suggest. Every cosmetic might contain untold suffering. Every add-on potentially reveals trapped soul. Every killer carries secrets beyond their hunting. We have explored only fraction of darkness available, only beginning of mysteries that entity's realm contains. Rest now with hour of theories complete, knowing that horror extends deeper than exploration reaches, that entity's domain keeps its deepest secrets still hidden in shadows we have not yet illuminated, that an hour merely scratches surface of suffering, that cosmic horror has accumulated across dimensions and eternities beyond human comprehension.